Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the cobblestoned world of ancient Rome. Picture yourself in sandals that never quite fit right, your tunic itching in the summer heat, and the scent of olive oil and fish sauce lingering uncomfortably in the air. You hear a street vendor calling out the price of figs, while a mule cart creaks behind you. It's noisy, it's dusty, and, let's be honest, you probably won't survive this long without a sunburn or a bad stomach from questionable wine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because you might fall asleep during this story and share only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, turn off the lights and lie down on your chair or bed, and let's begin tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice about Rome is the weight of expectation. Men are supposed to be men. Women are supposed to be women. But what does that even mean in a world where the emperor might appear in public in a toga of pure purple, strutting like a peacock, while the average man is judged more by the calluses on his hands than the length of his beard? You tread along the forum, passing senators in pristine white, their sandals polished, their expressions smug. Masculinity here isn't just about muscles. It's about authority, dignity, and the ever-watchful eyes of your peers. Historians still argue whether Roman ideals of masculinity were strict codes or more of a performance, but either way, you sense the tension. A man has to project virtus, a word meaning courage, manliness, and moral integrity. Imagine a blend of gym culture, LinkedIn bragging, and your dad's insistence on mowing the lawn in perfect lines, all rolled into one. You feel yourself standing straighter, chest puffed out just to fit in. And yet, this obsession with gender roles feels strangely fragile. Roman women, though supposedly relegated to domestic spheres, bustle around with a kind of invisible authority. At a market stall, a matron haggles so fiercely with a merchant that you suspect she could run half the city if she wanted. The official line is that women manage homes and children, while men manage politics and war. The reality? Well, you see plenty of women whispering into the ears of powerful husbands, and their influence is every bit as sharp as a senator's decree. You keep walking and nearly stumble into a procession. Musicians playing pipes, dancers moving through the crowd, priests in strange headgear waving censers of incense. A young couple follows behind, garlands of flowers strung around them. It's a wedding, and you realize marriages in Rome are rarely about romance. They're contracts designed to fuse two families' fortunes together like poorly mixed cement. The bride looks shy, but perhaps she's calculating too, wondering what her new household will demand. And then there's the whisper of desire, floating everywhere you turn. A poet scribbles verses at the fountain's edge, his lines equal parts swooning love and biting insult. A group of young men toss dice nearby, laughing a bit too loudly, brushing shoulders as if daring each other to hint at something unsaid. Rome is filled with statues of naked heroes, bodies carved so meticulously that you can't help but notice the way art itself blurs admiration and attraction. Your sandals scrape the paving stones as you wander past murals painted on villa walls. Some show gods embracing mortals. Others display banquets with reclining men and women sipping wine from shared cups. It's sensual, but not in the way you expect. More matter of fact, as if pleasure itself is another civic duty to be acknowledged and occasionally mocked. Romans didn't even have a word for homosexuality. They had categories for behavior, for dominance and submission, for who was supposed to be in control. The modern idea of fixed sexual identities? You wouldn't find that here. Instead, you find endless debates about whether a senator who flirted with a boy was disgraced, or simply following a Greek fad. And speaking of Greeks, the shadow of Greece stretches across every colonnade. Romans borrowed freely philosophy, art, and even certain ideas of love between men. Some Romans admired Greek intimacy between teacher and pupil. Others dismissed it as un-Roman weakness. You hear two men argue about it over a cup of watered wine, one praising the noble bond of mentorship, the other grumbling that Rome should stick to discipline, not indulgence. The air is thick with contradictions. A gladiator's sweaty fame might make him the object of whispered desire, yet the same fame brands him unsuitable for marriage with a respectable family. A woman may be praised for her chastity, but everyone knows witty empresses bend politics like bowstrings. Desire is everywhere, but respectability is the currency everyone guards like gold. You pause at the steps of a temple, the marble cold beneath your feet. The statue of Venus glitters in the sunlight, her stone curves as polished as any modern magazine cover. People toss offerings at her base, flowers, coins, a carved comb, hoping for favor in love. You realize the Romans didn't see gender and desire as neat boxes. They saw them as shifting performances on the stage of life. Each person judged not only by who they loved, but how they played their role in public. And as you turn away, following the hum of the city, you understand why historians still puzzle over it all. Was Rome repressive, liberated, hypocritical? Maybe all three, but for tonight, you simply let the contradictions lull you. Men puffing their chests, women smiling with hidden plans, and lovers of every kind weaving through the city streets like threads in an endless tapestry. You're still wandering those noisy Roman streets, but this time your eyes linger on the men themselves, the ones who strut, pose, and sigh about the weight of their responsibilities. If you thought modern men spent a lot of time flexing at the gym or adjusting their hair in the mirror, ancient Romans would absolutely win gold in self-consciousness. Here, being a man isn't just about surviving the battlefield or paying your taxes. It's about living up to an impossible checklist of virtues, most famously wrapped up in that heavy little word, virtus. Virtus didn't just mean courage. It meant honor, discipline, and behaving in ways that others would approve of. And let's be honest, that kind of pressure is exhausting. Imagine having your neighbors constantly watching whether your toga was clean enough, whether your handshake was firm, whether you walked too fast or too slow in the forum. You'd probably end up wishing for sweatpants and Netflix. But Rome doesn't give you that option. A mainstream fact? Roman men, especially the elite, were expected to speak well in public. Oratory was their version of TikTok clout. If you couldn't deliver a speech that made crowds cheer, or at least stay awake, you weren't really fulfilling your masculine duty. Boys from wealthy families trained in rhetoric schools, practicing speeches on topics like, should pirates be allowed to retire in peace? You imagine yourself nervously reciting while your teacher looks on, nodding sternly, maybe giving you a whack with a stick if you forget your lines. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Roman men were obsessed with their hair. Wigs, powders, even hairpieces made from German captives' blonde locks. Yes, that was a thing. You see an aging senator fiddling with his suspiciously golden curls while pretending to be all serious about state matters. One poet even mocked Julius Caesar for supposedly covering his bald spot with a comb-over and later a laurel wreath. The more things change, the more they stay the same. You chuckle to yourself because every era has its hair hacks. Yet beneath all this, the real secret to Roman masculinity is power. Not muscles, not charm, not even family. Power. Who commands and who obeys? Who dominates and who submits? Historians still argue whether Romans genuinely cared about love in the way we think of it, or if they just saw relationships as another arena to perform power. What mattered most wasn't who you were with, but how you carried yourself in that relationship. If you maintained dignity, if you looked like the one steering the ship, then you could get away with almost anything. Still, not every man made the cut. Gladiators, actors, even professional athletes. Yes, they were adored. Yes, women screamed their names. But polite society looked down on them. Why? Because they were considered too available, too public, too desperate for applause. In Roman eyes, a true man shouldn't be begging for attention. He should already command it by default. It's like the difference between being the celebrity and being the reality show contestant. You can guess which one carried prestige. As you walk past the baths, those steamy, echoing halls filled with gossip, you see Roman men of every stripe soaking, oiling themselves up, and boasting about their victories. The baths were basically a social media feed in stone and water. You'd hear arguments about politics, bragging about hunting trips, and subtle digs about who was looking a little soft around the belly. One man scrapes olive oil off his arms with a curved strigil, eyeing another man across the room. And you wonder, was that admiration? Rivalry? Maybe both. You pause, breathing in the tang of sulfur and sweat, and realize something. Masculinity in Rome is a performance, but it's one with very high stakes. Lose your dignity, and you lose your status. And once your status slips, your entire family's fortunes tumble with it. You're suddenly glad you don't have to live under that microscope, where even the way you laugh might earn ridicule. But then again, there's a playful absurdity to it all. Romans scolded young men for being too delicate, too Greek, too perfumed, and yet half the elite were secretly ordering fancy unguents and dabbing them behind their ears. One writer joked about men who spent more time plucking their armpit hair than preparing for battle. You smile, because it turns out hypocrisy is timeless. As the sun dips lower, you follow a group of toga-clad men toward the Senate. They walk deliberately, each trying to project seriousness, like contestants in the world's slowest fashion show. You notice how even their silence feels like a performance. Heads held high, arms tucked, expressions carefully composed. They pass by beggars, by traders, by young lovers kissing in the shadows, and you realize how much energy it takes to maintain this charade of proper Roman manhood. The weight of expectation presses down on you, too. Could you keep your toga spotless in the dust? Could you deliver an oration that made sense? Could you play the game of dominance without slipping? You probably wouldn't last a week, but in that realization, you feel the warm hum of empathy for these men, who, like so many after them, spent their lives acting out the endless play of masculinity. And as you drift deeper into the Roman evening, lulled by the rhythm of sandals on stone and the murmur of voices echoing through arches, you realize the truth. Being a Roman man was never about being yourself. It was about being what others demanded, and hoping you could fake it long enough to believe it yourself. You leave behind the swaggering men of the Forum and slip quietly into the villa courtyards where women spend much of their lives. Here, away from the clamor of soldiers and senators, the rhythm of Rome feels different. You hear the soft whir of spinning wheels, the clack of looms, and the murmur of voices blending with the trickle of a fountain. Marble statues glare from alcoves, but the real life is here. Women weaving cloth, directing servants, and tending to children with an efficiency that makes you wonder who really runs the empire. The mainstream fact hits you quickly. Roman women could not hold office, vote, or officially speak in public assemblies. Their world, on paper, was restricted to the private sphere. And yet, as you glance around, you notice how much authority they wield inside that space. A matron oversees the household accounts, her wax tablets filled with neat numbers. She orders jars of olive oil, arranges dowries for daughters, and negotiates with suppliers, all while the men brag outside about real politics. It's clear this domestic power was as crucial as any Senate decree. But let's sprinkle in a quirky tidbit: cosmetics. Roman women loved them, and some recipes sound like they belong in a witch's cupboard. Ground oyster shells for face powder, soot for eyeliner, crocodile dung. Yes, crocodile dung for certain skin treatments. You shiver at the thought, though you admit the smoky eyeliner effect looks pretty striking on the young woman peeking coyly from behind her veil. And historians still argue whether these beauty rituals were condemned as frivolous or quietly admired by the very men who mocked them. You step into another room and see women at different stages of life. The young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, is already being groomed for marriage alliances. The older matron, dignified and weary, remembers her own arranged union decades ago. In between, mothers balance children on their hips while issuing commands to slaves. You realize the household is a theater of constant negotiation. Who marries whom? Who inherits what? Who carries the family's reputation? Outside, in the peristyle garden, laughter breaks out. A group of women recline, with cups of watered wine, sharing gossip. You strain to catch words, snippets about a neighbor's scandal, a senator's latest folly, a whispered rumor that someone's husband has been seen with a boy from the baths. It's here, in the gossip, that women stitch themselves into the wider fabric of society. They cannot stand in the forum, but their whispers travel faster than official decrees. You pass by the kitchen, where the air is thick with herbs, smoke, and roasted meat. Women supervise the meals that will feed an entire household, including extended family and dozens of slaves. Imagine the pressure. One poorly baked loaf, one burnt stew, and the whole dinner party descends into grumbling. And because Romans loved their banquets, women bore the burden of ensuring the family always appeared prosperous, even when the pantry was bare. Yet, life wasn't all drudgery. Some women took pride in their domestic arts, weaving fine fabrics considered worthy of export, or overseeing gardens lush with roses, violets, and figs. These skills were praised by poets, who spun tales of the ideal Roman wife working at her loom with serene modesty. Of course, you suspect many women rolled their eyes at those verses while sneaking an extra sip of Falernian wine. One matron shows you her jewelry box: gold bracelets shaped like snakes, pearls gleaming like tiny moons, amulets promising fertility. The Romans adored adornments, but they also attached meaning. Pearls symbolized purity, snakes offered protection, and some charms promised to keep jealous husbands faithful. You wonder how well those charms worked. A scholarly debate circles in your mind. Were Roman women genuinely trapped in domestic spaces? Or did they subtly control society through influence, arrangement, and wealth management? Some historians argue the former, painting a picture of repression. Others insist that women's roles, though hidden, were essential and sometimes decisive in shaping Roman politics and culture. Watching the quiet confidence of the matron with her wax tablets, you lean toward the second view. Night falls, and you feel the shift in atmosphere. Lamps glow with olive oil. Shadows flicker along painted walls. Women gather children close, hum lullabies, or share stories about the gods: Venus, Juno, Diana, each embodying different models of femininity. You notice how religion threads through their lives: offerings to household gods, prayers for healthy births, whispered invocations before marriages. The scent of burning incense lingers as you leave the villa, carrying with you the impression that the Roman household was no less political than the Senate. The men might wear purple-bordered togas, but the women's careful hands kept the empire stitched together in daily life. And as you drift further into this quiet domestic world, you realize something. Power doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes it weaves, it whispers, it raises children who will one day stride through the forum, pretending it was all their idea. You rise the next morning to the sound of flutes and laughter echoing down a Roman street. Your sandals crunch over petals scattered across the paving stones, because today is a wedding day, and Rome loves a good public spectacle. You catch the bride and groom walking in procession, her veil dyed a bright saffron, his toga spotless and carefully arranged. To modern eyes, it might look sweet, but here you quickly realize marriage isn't about romance. It's politics dressed up with flowers. The mainstream fact hits you. Roman marriages were contracts between families. They secured alliances, merged wealth, and ensured heirs. A daughter was less a free spirit choosing her path and more a valuable chess piece on her father's board. One senator arranges a match between his girl of 14 and a man twice her age, not because she swoons over him, but because their estates border each other. You stand to the side and wonder how much the young bride even understands of the deal. But then you notice a quirky tidbit. At the wedding feast, someone hands out spelt cakes, a throwback to Rome's oldest rituals. Guests laugh and eat, but the bride is expected to perform the conferatio ceremony, nibbling the cake to symbolize the union. Meanwhile, Roman grooms often pretended to kidnap the bride from her mother's arms, dragging her theatrically into the new household. You can't help but smile at how much of this pageantry feels like live-action role-play mixed with accounting paperwork. Historians still argue whether Roman couples found genuine affection in these arrangements. Some evidence suggests marriages blossomed into companionship, while other accounts describe cold unions where husbands sought pleasure elsewhere, whether with women, boys, or slaves, while wives managed homes in silence. The truth, you realize, was probably both. Some couples laughed together over figs. Others barely exchanged a word. At the wedding feast, music plays while guests recline on couches, tossing grapes and cracking jokes. The bride sits nervously, and you can feel her balancing act. Be modest but not dour, charming but not bold. Roman poets praise the ideal wife as silent, obedient, and fertile. But if you listen closely, you also hear whispers about clever women who wielded real power through wit and charm. It was a tightrope, and not everyone balanced gracefully. You drift further, watching servants pour wine into shallow cups. The groom's friends rib him, warning of sleepless nights and nagging in-laws. One elderly man mutters that marriage is a trap, better suited to securing heirs than securing happiness. Another jokes that at least a wife keeps you from drinking all the wine yourself. 3 chuckles later, you realize that humor hasn't changed much in 2,000 years. The ceremony winds down, and the new couple walks to their home, escorted by torchbearers. Roman superstition says these flames ward off evil spirits, though you suspect the real danger is tripping on cobblestones in front of your entire extended family. The bride touches the household hearth, symbolically becoming part of her husband's family. You picture the countless women before her repeating this same gesture, their lives shifting with the flicker of a flame. And yet, even in this tightly choreographed ritual, you sense cracks. Women might not choose their husbands, but some carved out surprising space within marriage. Letters survive of wives speaking fondly of their husbands, others complaining bitterly about neglect. In some rare cases, women even divorced men, sending them back their dowries with a pointed message: thanks, but no thanks. Night falls again, and the wedding party continues. You watch guests snore on couches, drool mixing with spilled wine. The bride retreats inside, and the groom follows, while the household bustles to clean up the aftermath. Outside, the stars glitter faintly, and you imagine countless other weddings playing out across Rome. Each one a blend of duty, pageantry, and perhaps a little hope. As you lie back against a column, lulled by the distant sound of pipes, you reflect that marriage in Rome was never really about 2 people. It was about families, wealth, politics, and appearances. Love might sneak in later, like a vine climbing over marble walls. Or it might not. But either way, the saffron veil, the spelt cake, and the torchlight march would roll on, binding generation after generation into the endless Roman play of alliances. You linger now in the quieter courtyards, where the conversations shift from contracts and dowries to ideals and expectations. The poets and philosophers whisper of the perfect Roman woman, though their visions sound suspiciously like men writing shopping lists. You hear words repeated again and again. Pudicitia, modesty. Castitas, chastity. Obedientia, obedience. In their minds, the ideal wife is silent, fertile, and endlessly patient. You picture her spinning wool in the corner, eyes down, lips sealed, like a decorative statue that just happens to breathe. The mainstream fact is clear. Roman culture, at least officially, exalted women who embraced simplicity and domestic labor. Emperors even praised wives who wove their own clothes instead of buying luxuries. Augustus loved to parade his daughter Julia as a paragon of Roman virtue, until, of course, her actual behavior didn't match the advertisement. That gap between ideal and reality is where things get interesting. Here's your quirky tidbit. Statues of Pudicitia, the goddess of modesty, were popular in Roman homes. Women prayed before them for guidance in remaining properly restrained. But ironically, some of the same women commissioning those statues were known for lavish parties, witty poems, and not-so-secret affairs. It's like hanging a live, laugh, love sign in a house where everyone is constantly arguing. The image is comforting, but the reality is far messier. Historians still argue whether these ideals genuinely shaped women's daily lives or were more propaganda, a way for men to flatter themselves with the illusion of control. Some sources show women publicly embracing modesty, while others hint at clever resistance. Did women truly believe modesty was the highest virtue? Or did they smile sweetly while plotting how to bend rules in their favor? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. As you stroll through the villa, you see paintings of women on the walls, goddesses with flowing robes, matrons holding keys, maidens offering fruit. Each image reinforces the message. A woman's value lies in her purity, her service to family, her ability to blend seamlessly into the background. But then you notice the glint of jewelry, the delicate folds of imported silk, the faint smile suggesting these ideal women had plenty of opinions behind their painted lips. You overhear a group of men at dinner, praising their wives' modesty, while simultaneously reciting Ovid's verses about seduction. The contradiction is almost funny. Men demanded chastity from their wives, yet adored poetry about passionate affairs. One even brags about his wife's weaving skills, though you catch a servant rolling her eyes. Clearly, the woman hasn't touched a loom in years, and so, the performance continues. Wives sit quietly at banquets, pretending disinterest, while everyone knows they catch every word. Daughters are paraded as examples of virtue, though the gossip network hums with scandal. The tension between image and reality keeps the whole society humming, like a lyre with strings just slightly out of tune. At night, when lamps flicker and shadows dance on plastered walls, you imagine a Roman woman slipping off her heavy veil, sighing with relief, and laughing quietly with her friends. Perhaps she tells a story about a husband's ridiculous toga stain, or a senator's drunken speech, or a god who never lived up to his promises. These moments of levity remind you that behind the marble mask of Pudicitia, there was always a beating heart. And as you settle deeper into this vision, you realize the ideal Roman woman wasn't just an expectation, it was a myth. A myth enforced by statues, poems, and speeches but softened, challenged, and reshaped by the real women who had to live under its weight. You slip away from the whisper of saffron veils and torchlit processions and drift into the spaces where Roman women stepped beyond the villa walls. Here, the air feels different, half freedom, half scrutiny. A woman in public is never just herself. She's an emblem, a warning, a spectacle, a rumor. You sense how carefully they moved, balancing what society allowed with what they themselves wanted. The most striking example sits right in the forum, the round temple of Vesta, glowing like a pale pearl against the bustle of the city. Inside, 6 priestesses tend the eternal flame, their veils arranged in careful folds, their expressions serious enough to hush even the rowdiest soldier. A mainstream fact here is that the Vestal virgins were among the few women in Rome to hold legal independence. They could own property, make wills, ride in carriages, and had seats of honor at games. Their job? Keep the sacred fire alive, because Romans believed the fate of the empire flickered in its flames. You watch a young Vestal sweep ashes, her gestures deliberate, and you realize how much of Rome's sense of stability rested in women who weren't even supposed to speak in politics. Yet every candle has shadows. A quirky tidbit emerges. The Vestals prepared a ritual flour mixture, mola salsa, to sprinkle on sacrifices. It was so famous that recipes drifted into kitchens as seasoning. Imagine cooking dinner with a pinch of holy flour, whispering to yourself, "This will definitely keep my husband faithful." You chuckle, because humans never resist sneaking a sacred spice into the pantry. But the danger was real. If the flame ever went out, people panicked, muttering that disaster loomed. And if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was grim, being buried alive outside the city. You shiver at the thought, staring at the flicker of firelight. Historians still argue whether these trials were genuine justice or political theater to remove inconvenient women. Perhaps both. Leaving the temple, you follow music toward the theater district. Painted banners flap in the breeze, advertising comedies, tragedies, mimes. Here, women could step on stage, dazzling audiences with dance, song, and wit. The catch? Society branded them infames, dishonorable. A mainstream fact. Senators were forbidden to marry actresses. Yet the hypocrisy was thick as garum. Wealthy men filled the front rows, tossing roses and sighs toward the very women they condemned in daylight. Backstage, smells of lamp oil and beeswax. Costumes hang on hooks, brightly dyed cloaks, masks with gaping mouths, padded bellies for comic effect. One actress adjusts her jewelry in a bronze mirror, humming under her breath. Another dabs lamp soot to darken her eyebrows. A poet, tipsy on cheap wine, promises to immortalize them in verse. The actors tease him, asking whether he'll clean their sandals too. You grin. It's chaos, but it's alive. The performance begins. A comic scene has the audience roaring. A pompous senator with an exaggerated toga trip falls flat on his face. You laugh along, realizing satire is timeless. Then comes the dancers, graceful, magnetic. You watch how every gesture captures attention, how silence itself becomes power, and you wonder, were these women powerless, or had they found a loophole? Historians still debate whether female performers were trapped in exploitation or wielded subtle control through fame. Perhaps, like today's celebrities, they lived in both worlds at once. Now, your steps carry you uphill to the palaces of the Palatine. Here, women are never billed as public officials, yet they breathe influence into every corridor. A mainstream fact: empresses like Livia, Agrippina, and Faustina shaped politics through patronage, coin imagery, and family alliances. Coins bear their portraits with captions like peace or fertility, making them walking propaganda campaigns stamped into silver. Every transaction whispered their names across the empire. You enter a shaded garden where an empress tends to laurel trees. She gifts cuttings to allies, turning plants into politics. Another experiments with hairstyles, arranging curls piled high like towers. Within months, Roman matrons across the empire will copy the look. Barbers snipping, slaves twisting, fashion shifting faster than you'd think possible without Instagram. Jewelry gleams in bowls, pearls, emeralds, golden snake bracelets. A quirky tidbit? Pliny the Elder swore that Lollia Paulina once appeared dripping with pearls worth 40 million sesterces. You blink. That's basically showing up to brunch wearing the GDP of a province. But gossip walks these halls too. You hear whispers of Agrippina accused of ambition, of Messalina mocked in scandalous tales, of Faustina praised for compassion. Were these stories truth or smear campaigns? Historians still argue whether imperial women were ruthless schemers or victims of male propaganda. You suspect the answer is yes to both. After all, Rome never wasted an opportunity to exaggerate a juicy rumor. You pause in a colonnade as night drapes itself over the city. Torches sputter. Somewhere, the Vestals tend the flame. Down below, the theaters echo with laughter. Here in the palace, women whisper in marble chambers, shaping decisions that ripple outward like waves. Public power may officially belong to men, but women's hands, veiled or jeweled, adjust the levers in ways no law book records. As you sink onto a stone bench, listening to the distant hum of Rome, you realize this. Public women carried paradox. They were sacred, yet vulnerable, admired, yet mocked, invisible, yet essential. The firekeepers, the actresses, the empresses, each walked a tightrope stretched between reverence and suspicion. And in their footsteps, you sense both the fragility and the resilience of an empire that never quite knew how to contain them. The city is quieter now, but the murmur of verses carries through narrow alleys and echoing courtyards. Poetry in Rome is more than decoration. It's gossip, seduction, satire, and a kind of public diary that everyone is free to peek into. You drift toward a circle of men with tablets and styluses, their voices rising and falling in measured rhythm, like waves lapping against stone. And in their lines, you glimpse how Romans tangled love, lust, and laughter together. A mainstream fact first. Roman poets like Catullus and Ovid immortalized passion in a way no senator's speech ever could. Catullus, for example, wrote wildly of his beloved Lesbia, sometimes adoring her kisses as many as the stars, sometimes raging at her betrayal, sometimes mocking her in bitterness. You smile, recognizing that hot and cold relationship energy transcends centuries. Ovid, meanwhile, penned his Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, a how-to manual for flirting, wooing, and yes, even sneaky tricks to win affection. Romans might have blushed publicly, but they devoured his verses like today's best-selling dating guides. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Ovid actually advised women to read while reclining at the races, turning the Circus Maximus into the ancient world's version of speed dating. He also recommended using small dogs as conversation starters. Yes, 2,000 years ago, Romans were already pulling the cute pet card. You imagine a lady deliberately dropping her lapdog's leash just to catch the eye of a young rider. Subtle? Not at all. Effective? Ovid swore it was. Historians still argue whether these poems reflected real social behavior or were playful exaggerations. Was Ovid describing Rome's love life as it was, or as readers wished it could be? Either way, his advice got him exiled by Augustus. Proof that even emperors didn't want their daughters practicing too much ars amatoria. Around you, a poet clears his throat dramatically. He recites a mocking epigram about a man who kisses too loudly in public, earning chuckles. Another spins, verses about longing, each word like honey poured onto figs. The audience sighs, their eyes half-lidded from wine, letting words blur into dream. Poetry in Rome is entertainment, but it's also social currency. If you can rhyme well enough, you just might earn a patron's favor or catch someone's attention across the atrium. You wander to a villa, wall painted with graffiti. Yes, graffiti. Scratched words of affection. Marcus loves Julia, or scandal. Cornelius kisses boys. These casual lines echo the themes of poets, but rawer, funnier, sometimes crueler. They remind you that Roman romance wasn't always lofty. It was often messy, and sometimes hilariously petty. At a banquet later, a performer reads Propertius, praising his lover Cynthia, while the diners nudge each other, whispering about whether Cynthia was even real. You can almost hear the modern equivalent. Is that poem really about her, or just for clout? Some guests roll their eyes, others lean forward, intoxicated not by wine, but by the rhythm of desire shaped into words. A lamp sputters low, and a guest mutters that poetry is dangerous, that it tempts wives, inflames men, and fills heads with unrealistic fantasies. Another retorts that poetry keeps Rome alive, giving voice to feelings too slippery for prose. Historians still debate whether these verses reveal real intimacy or just literary performance. But as you listen, the laughter and sighs suggest that audiences felt every word, whether true or not. Outside, the night air is cool, carrying faint echoes of a lover's quarrel. Shouts, then a slammed door, then silence. You imagine Catullus somewhere scribbling a furious line, ready to immortalize heartbreak as fast as any teenager today on social media. You smile, because in Rome, as now, people couldn't resist turning private feelings into public art. You walk on, hearing lines of Ovid roll again in your memory. Love is a kind of war. But here, under Rome's moonlight, love feels less like a battlefield and more like an open-air theater where every sigh, Every glance, every sarcastic verse becomes part of the performance. And as you finally lean against a column, letting the soft rhythm of poetry wash over you, your eyelids droop. Words blur into music. Affection, satire, scandal, they swirl together, reminding you that in Rome, poetry wasn't just for books. It was for life, for love, for laughter, and for lulling you, even now, into sleep. Morning creeps in, with the sounds of sandals scuffing on stone and young voices reciting verses. You follow the trail into a shaded courtyard where a group of boys practice oratory under the stern gaze of a tutor. Their wax tablets glisten with half-smeared words. Their eyes dart nervously to catch a mistake before the rod lands. This is where Roman men are made, or at least where people pretend to mold them into the citizens they're supposed to become. The mainstream fact is clear. Roman education, especially for elite boys, was less about math and more about rhetoric, law, and memorizing poetry. A young man had to know how to quote Homer, deliver a speech, and argue persuasively, because oratory was the gateway to politics. Imagine yourself standing at 13, voice cracking, trying to declaim about the bravery of Aeneas while your classmates snicker. You'd probably pray for a fire drill. But Rome doesn't do fire drills. It does discipline. Yet behind the recitations lurks another layer. Boys and their tutors often formed bonds that blurred the line between mentorship and intimacy. Roman culture absorbed this idea partly from Greece, where relationships between older men and youths were idealized as educational, moral, and, depending on the city, romantic. Romans, however, had mixed feelings. Some admired the Greek influence, others mocked it as decadent. And you, listening in the corner, can hear the tension in every whispered rumor about who favored which pupil. A quirky tidbit drifts to you. Some teachers were notorious for being too affectionate, and satirists loved to joke about it. Marshall once quipped about a grammarian more interested in boys than grammar. You imagine that students' homework grades went mysteriously higher than deserved. Of course, not everyone approved. One old man in the crowd mutters that such softness will ruin Rome's moral fiber, though his neighbors look suspiciously amused. Historians still argue whether these bonds were widespread practice or exaggerated caricature. Did most Roman boys experience mentorship as primarily educational, or did it often shade into intimacy? The evidence is patchy. Some inscriptions praise loving relationships between older men and youths, while others condemn them as shameful. You realize Rome lived in contradiction, borrowing Greece's ideas, but twisting them to fit Roman obsessions with status and control. You step into the baths, another arena where men and boys mingled. Steam rises, voices echo, and laughter bounces off marble walls. A group of young men splash one another, while an older patron lounges nearby, offering advice that sounds suspiciously like flattery. You notice the way glances linger, how proximity becomes a language. The baths weren't just about hygiene. They were about networking, mentoring, gossiping, and yes, sometimes flirting. The expectation always returned to dominance. A Roman man could admire a youth, but only if he maintained his role as the active partner, the one in control. If the roles flipped, society frowned. That obsession with control, more than gender, defined Roman attitudes toward love between men. A man might desire a boy or another man, but only as long as he looked powerful doing it. Imagine a society where your bedroom posture could make or break your reputation. Exhausting, right? Still, as you sit on a warm bench, you can't ignore how much affection shines through the cracks. Graffiti scratches out the names of boys adored. Poems capture the tenderness of mentors, and some epitaphs describe bonds that lasted decades. Beyond the rigid rules, real feelings seeped through. Friendship, admiration, even love. You picture two men walking together down a dusty road, talking of Homer or dreams. The rest of Rome pretending not to notice. Later that evening, you hear a poet mocking men who let themselves be swayed by boys' beauty. He rolls his eyes, declaring that true Romans should stick to wives and politics. His audience laughs politely, but you sense a quiet rebellion in the silence that follows. Everyone knows desire doesn't vanish just because someone mocks it. Rome, with all its rules, couldn't cage the heart entirely. As the lamps flicker in the atrium, you watch the young students pack up their tablets, shoulders sore from the day. Some rush home, some linger near their tutors, hoping for one last word of praise. The streets echo with footsteps and hushed chatter, the line between learning and longing blurred in the twilight. You exhale, realizing that Roman boyhood was never simple. It was training for politics, yes, but it was also an education in desire, status, and the strange balancing act between admiration and authority. As you walk back toward your lodging, you glance at the stars and think, every society invents rules for love, and every society finds ways to break them. Rome was no different. You step once more into the Roman streets, but now your ears tune differently. You listen not for the clang of vendors or the sermons of senators, but for the ways Romans described love between men. And soon you realize something odd. There isn't even a word for what we today call homosexuality. There is no single label, no tidy identity. Instead, Rome sorts intimacy into roles, not categories. Who dominates, who submits, who holds power, who yields. That is the dividing line, sharper than gender itself. A mainstream fact helps anchor this. Roman writers often judged relationships less by the sex of the partners and more by the status of the participants. A citizen male was expected to take the active role, whether with a woman, a boy, or even a slave. To flip that dynamic, especially to be the receptive partner, was branded humiliating. In Roman eyes, it chipped away at virtus, the prized quality of masculine strength. You imagine a senator carefully managing his public dignity, even while rumors swirl about his private indulgences. Now, for the quirky tidbit, Romans coined colorful insults for men accused of being too submissive. Words like Sinaitus or Pathicus flew around the baths and marketplaces, often exaggerated for satire. Some graffiti from Pompeii mocks men for moaning like girls or preferring to bend. It's crass, but it reveals how Romans turned sexual behavior into comedy and insult. You smirk, realizing the ancient world was just as fond of bathroom humor as modern teenagers. Historians still argue whether these slurs reveal common practice or merely anxieties exaggerated in jokes. Were submissive roles truly despised by everyone, or did satire magnify a prejudice to make audiences laugh? The debate lingers because evidence points in both directions. A man might be mocked in poetry for being too receptive, yet inscriptions show lasting same-sex partnerships honored in tombstones. The contradiction hums beneath the marble surface. You pass by a wall painting in a tavern. Two figures entwined, one clearly in control, the other yielding. The audience laughs and nudges because everyone recognizes the visual shorthand. Here, intimacy is displayed like a coded message, understood by locals, scandalous to strangers. It reminds you that Roman sexuality was public in strange ways. Art, jokes, graffiti, yet carefully policed in terms of reputation. Later, in the baths, you overhear whispers about a senator who favors younger men. The gossip doesn't dwell on attraction itself, but on whether he acts Roman or acts Greek. To be Greek in this context means too indulgent, too passive, too emotional. You chuckle at how Rome constantly defined itself by comparing against Greece, admiring its culture while mocking its softness. It's like a younger sibling, both idolizing and teasing the older one. By lamplight in a tavern, poets swap verses. One teases a rival for wearing out his knees. Another praises a youth's beauty like he's a living statue of Apollo. The audience roars, some pretending scandal, others sighing in admiration. You feel the contradictions swirl, disapproval and desire, scorn and longing. No wonder the Romans never coined a single word. They lived in the gray, too entangled to separate neatly. You pause beneath an arch as the night deepens. Somewhere, lovers slip quietly through side streets. Maybe a man visits a courtesan. Maybe another meets a friend in a shadowed corner. There are no rainbow flags, no identity terms, no slogans, just choices, gestures, roles. And you realize Rome wasn't without queerness. It was simply without our modern categories, wrapping intimacy instead in status, dominance, and reputation. The contradictions echo in your mind. To be loved by another man wasn't condemned. To be penetrated, if you were a citizen male, was shame. To admire a youth's beauty was praised. To lose control to desire was mocked. A messy code, but one everyone understood. As you walk back to your lodging, the laughter from taverns fades, replaced by the soft crackle of oil lamps. You think about the silence of language, the absence of one word for love between men, and how that silence speaks louder than any label. For the Romans, desire existed, but identity did not. And that difference shapes every story they told, every law they passed, every whisper carried on the midnight breeze. You leave behind the laughter of taverns and the cheeky graffiti of Pompeii, and you step into a colder space, the invisible ledger where Romans weighed desire against status. For them, intimacy wasn't about romance or orientation, as you might think today. It was about hierarchy. The question whispered in alleys and shouted in satire was never simply, "Who do you love?" but always who's in control. The mainstream fact becomes plain. Roman moralists judged sexual relationships based on power dynamics. A freeborn male citizen could maintain his honor so long as he played the active role, whether with a woman, a slave, or a youth. The moment he submitted, his reputation cracked. To be penetrated was to surrender one's masculine dignity, collapsing that fragile Roman ideal of virtues. You picture senators strutting like roosters in public, terrified of a rumor that might suggest the wrong posture in private. And then, the quirky tidbit, some Romans wore amulets called fascina, tiny phallic charms, believed to ward off the evil eye, and conveniently assert virility. You see one dangling from a child's neck, another carved on a soldier's shield, and even one painted above a bakery. Imagine a society so obsessed with projecting dominance that even bread ovens sported little carved reminders of who's in charge. You chuckle, because it's both ridiculous and revealing. Historians still argue whether this fixation on dominance was truly universal, or mainly an obsession of the elite. Some inscriptions show same-sex couples remembered with tenderness, suggesting ordinary people may have cared less about rigid hierarchies. But elite literature drips with scorn for submissive men, implying at least the upper classes police themselves viciously. The truth, as usual, lies between marble and mud. You stroll into a dinner party where the wine flows thick and tongues grow looser. A poet sneers at a rival for losing his toga to desire, while others laugh. Yet in the corner, two men whisper with heads close, oblivious to the mockery. You realize how much of Roman intimacy existed in this double world: public scorn, private tenderness. A senator might condemn unmanly behavior in speeches, only to slip into it himself when doors closed. Walking home afterward, you pass a dark alley where a slave waits nervously for his master. And here lies the heart of Rome's hierarchy. Slaves had no say, no reputation to lose, no identity to guard. A citizen could use them as he pleased, and society looked the other way. You feel a pang, realizing that power structured not just gossip, but people's bodies, reducing some to vessels for another's display of dominance. The baths, again, provide their own theater. One man reclines arrogantly, boasting of his conquests. Another sits quieter, eyes tracing someone across the steam. Around them, laughter, teasing, sometimes cruel. And you can't shake the thought. How exhausting it must have been to weigh every glance, every rumor, every touch against the scale of status. Imagine having to think, not, do I love him, but will this make me look weak? Later, you hear of a case where a man was prosecuted not for his desire, but for dishonoring his family by being too receptive. The law didn't target love, it targeted shame. That's the Roman paradox. It wasn't who you touched, but how you looked doing it. And yet, despite the rules, desire kept breaking through. Graffiti, poems, whispered oaths at night, all proof that feelings overflowed the marble jars of status. You recall Catullus raging and swooning, Ovid teaching tricks at the races, ordinary graffiti confessing quick crushes. Beneath the obsession with dominance, the heart still beats stubbornly, refusing to stay tidy. As you rest on a stone step, The hum of the city lulls you. Torches gutter, voices fade, and you understand Rome's peculiar truth. Intimacy was never private. It was political theater. Every touch, every rumor, every poem was judged by who had power. And you let that thought sink in like warm bathwater, realizing just how different and how familiar it all feels. The lamps along the Palatine Hill still glow faintly as you climb marble stairs that creak under centuries of sandals. Tonight, you are not here for senators or generals, but for the emperors, those men wrapped in purple who supposedly ruled everything, including their own desires. Yet behind the gleam of statues and the thunder of legions lies another truth. Emperors were also gossip magnets, their private affairs spilling across Rome like wine down a tablecloth. A mainstream fact: Julius Caesar, Rome's most famous conqueror, was dogged by rumors of an affair with King Nicomedes of Bithynia. His soldiers, ever the comedians, sang on campaign about how their commander conquered Gaul but was conquered by Nicomedes. You picture Caesar pretending not to hear while secretly fuming. Nothing cuts deeper in Rome than being accused of yielding. The joke clung to him his whole life, proof that even an empire builder couldn't escape the politics of dominance. Here's a quirky tidbit. Suetonius reports that Caesar was teased as every woman's man and every man's woman. Not the slogan you'd want printed on campaign posters, but it stuck. And yet, Rome adored him anyway, because success on the battlefield covered a multitude of whispered sins. You smirk, thinking how reputations could be both fragile and bulletproof at the same time. Historians still argue whether those rumors were based in fact or invented by rivals. Was Caesar truly intimate with Nicomedes? Or was it just the ancient version of political mudslinging? Either way, the gossip became part of his legend, showing how personal lives could never be separated from public power. Move forward a century, and you find Emperor Hadrian, who reshaped this narrative in marble. Hadrian adored Antinous, a Greek youth whose beauty became immortalized in statues across the empire. When Antinous drowned in the Nile, Hadrian wept openly, founded a city in his name, and filled Rome with images of his beloved. Walk through the sculpture gardens, and you see Antinous everywhere, curled in stone, forever youthful, forever mourned. Unlike Caesar's rumors, Hadrian's devotion was undeniable. And yet, even this story is tangled. Some praised Hadrian for his loyalty. Others whispered that mourning a boy so extravagantly was unmanly. Still, Hadrian's grief carved itself into history, and statues of Antinous survive in museums today, reminding you how one emperor's love left ripples that outlasted laws and gossip. Not every imperial romance was remembered kindly. Nero, infamous for setting standards of extravagance, married a freedman named Pythagoras in a public ceremony. Except Nero took the role of the bride, veiled and all. You can almost hear the gasps echo through Rome, senators clutching their pearls. A mainstream fact here: Nero actually held 2 same-sex weddings, flipping the Roman code of dominance on its head. Some saw it as theater, others as sacrilege. Either way, it gave satirists endless material. Picture the palace corridors buzzing, servants whispering about Nero's antics, senators scribbling sarcastic notes, poets crafting biting verses. And then imagine Nero himself, strumming a lyre, utterly unconcerned, convinced that his songs and spectacles mattered more than convention. You lean against a column and chuckle. It's pure chaos, but chaos in purple robes. What strikes you most is how emperors became mirrors for Roman anxieties. Caesar's rumored submission, Hadrian's public grief, Nero's flamboyant weddings, each tested the boundaries of what Romans thought acceptable. Historians still debate. Did emperors set the tone for society's views on love? Or did they simply expose the contradictions already there? You suspect both are true. As night deepens, you wander the palace gardens. Statues of gods gleam in torchlight, each frozen in embraces. Zeus with Ganymede, Venus with Mars. A servant lights another lamp, and you catch your reflection in polished bronze. For a moment, you imagine being one of those emperors, caught between personal desire and the sharp gaze of a million citizens, knowing that even your kisses could become political weapons. The hum of Rome below fades into a softer rhythm. You think of Caesar's songs, Hadrian's statues, Nero's veils, love and scandal etched into stone, gossip carried on the wind. And you realize emperors, for all their crowns and titles, were just as vulnerable to longing and to laughter as anyone else in the empire. You wander down from the palaces into Rome's streets again, where the gossip doesn't wait for emperors. It flourishes in the mouths of satirists and the ink of poets. The empire may have been built on marble, but its jokes were carved out of sarcasm. If the senators tried to set the rules of dignity, the satirists made a career of tripping them on the way out the door. A mainstream fact first. Satire was one of Rome's proudest literary exports. Men, like Juvenal and Martial, sharpened their quills on hypocrisy, exposing the absurdity of society's double standards. Juvenal, in particular, had a knack for mocking men who wore too much perfume, curled their hair like women, or strutted in public like peacocks. To him, these were signs of moral decay, a symptom of Rome going soft. You listen as a street performer recites Juvenal's lines, and the crowd howls, some because they agree, others because they recognize themselves in the parody. Now for a quirky tidbit. Martial once wrote entire epigrams joking about men who kissed too loudly, or who fussed over their appearance so much that their mires probably deserved voting rights. In one famous dig, he teased a man for having smoother legs than most women, a result, no doubt, of obsessive plucking. You smirk, because nothing ages faster than fashion, and yet nothing ever really changes. Historians still argue whether these descriptions reflect actual widespread behavior, or if satirists exaggerated to shock their audiences. Were Roman men really roaming the streets in makeup and depilated arms? Or was that the ancient equivalent of a late-night talk show skit? Some evidence suggests the grooming culture was real. Roman barbershops were packed. But satire thrived on blowing details out of proportion. As you stroll further, you pass tavern walls scribbled with caricatures, crude drawings of senators with exaggerated noses, graffiti mocking someone's rumored trysts. Pompeii's ruins preserve some of this graffiti, lines so sharp they'd make modern comedians proud. One wall reads, "Epaphra is a gladiator's delight." Another proclaims, Celadus the Thracian makes the girls sigh. The jokes don't spare anyone. Elite, slave, man, woman. Rome is equal opportunity when it comes to ridicule. At a dinner party, the jokes take on another flavor. A poet lampoons a rival for acting like a bride in bed, while another ridicules women who dare speak too boldly. The guests laugh, wine sloshing over ivory couches. Some laugh because it's genuinely funny, others because not laughing would mark them as humorless, or worse, as the butt of the next verse. You realize how dangerous satire could be. Laughter was soothing, but it also reinforced the very boundaries it mocked. Yet satire also revealed what people secretly obsessed over. If Juvenal spends 10 lines sneering at men in makeup, it's because men in makeup existed. If Marshall can name men who sleep with both boys and wives, it's because society noticed. The jokes, in their way, are evidence, proof of a world where gender and sexuality were endlessly negotiated, teased, and tested. A quirky scene unfolds in the forum, a mime performance. Actors in masks exaggerate roles of domineering wives, henpecked husbands, effeminate men. The crowd howls, even children giggle, though they probably don't grasp all the innuendos. It's slapstick, but with teeth. You watch a man in a ridiculous wig stumble across the stage, pretending to swoon over a gladiator, and the audience explodes in laughter. The message is clear. Comedy wasn't just entertainment, it was a mirror. Crooked, yes, but still a reflection. Historians still argue how much weight to give this mirror. Was satire shaping public morals, or simply reflecting anxieties that already swirled beneath Rome's marble surface? You suspect both, as satire always punches in two directions, mocking the deviant while secretly acknowledging how common the deviation must be. As the night wears on, you lean against a wall, hearing laughter spill into the streets. Somewhere, a boy hums a line of Marshall like a catchy tune. Somewhere else, an old man repeats Juvenal's warnings about moral decline, shaking his head. And you recognize a pattern. Rome kept joking about gender roles and sexual behaviors not because they were rare, but because they were everywhere. The torches burn lower, shadows stretching long. The jokes fade to whispers, then to snores as revelers doze off in the streets, and you let the humor soften your thoughts, knowing that satire, however sharp, always lulled Rome into the comfort of shared laughter, even as it revealed the messiness nobody wanted to admit outright. You drift from the noisy laughter of taverns toward the solemn hush of temples, where incense curls upward and priests chant in low voices. Here, the air smells of sacrifice, burnt grain, a hint of animal fat, and the mood turns heavier. Rome's ideas about men, women, and desire weren't only shaped by gossip and satire, they were also framed by religion, by the gods themselves, who seemed to wink at human behavior even while punishing excess. A mainstream fact, Roman religion was polytheistic, and gods were everywhere. Venus promised love, Mars promised strength, Diana guarded chastity, Priapus, yes, the garden god with an outrageously oversized symbol, promised fertility and also comic relief. People prayed to these deities not just for victories in war, but for help in the bedroom, in marriage, in childbirth. Desire, in Rome, was never private. It was entangled with ritual. You see offerings laid at Venus's temple, doves, mirrors, even combs, each a whispered hope for romance or beauty. And then a quirky tidbit. Priapus statues were placed in gardens, not only to ensure fertility, but also to scare off thieves. Because who wants to be chased by a god with that kind of weapon? Graffiti even records jokes like, "Priapus, if you guard the lettuce as well as you threaten thieves, we'll eat well this winter." You chuckle, imagining neighbors walking past, smirking at the sight while pretending to be solemn. Yet religion wasn't all cheeky. The Vestal virgins you met earlier remind you of Rome's obsession with purity. Their vow of chastity was seen as central to Rome's safety. If one failed, she endangered not just herself, but the whole empire. And historians still argue whether this was about true piety or simply using religion to police women's bodies. Either way, the flame they kept alive burned as much for control as for devotion. You wander into another temple, this one of Cybele, the Magna Mater, the Great Mother, imported from Asia Minor. Her priests, the Galli, performed ecstatic rituals, drumming, dancing, sometimes even castrating themselves in devotion. To Roman eyes, this was both fascinating and disturbing. On the one hand, it showed ultimate dedication. On the other, it blurred gender boundaries in ways conservative Romans mocked. Satirists joked cruelly about the Galli, but pilgrims still thronged to the goddess. Religion, here, broke the very lines society tried to draw. In the household shrines, you find lares and penates, the little gods of hearth and pantry. Families offered food, wine, and prayers to keep daily life in harmony. A mother might whisper for her daughter's safe marriage, a father for his son's fertility. It's intimate, almost cozy, like bedtime prayers, but always tied to the family's future, never just the individual. Even festivals carried the weight of gender and desire. During the Floralia, prostitutes danced openly in the streets, a rare moment of sanctioned boldness. Crowds laughed, tossed flowers, and pretended not to be scandalized. During the Lupercalia, men ran half-naked through the city, striking women lightly with goat-hide whips to ensure fertility. You shake your head. It looks like frat party meets religion, but the Romans swore by its power. As the night deepens, you step into a temple of Venus, where couples leave garlands, hoping their passion won't fade. Candles flicker, shadows dance, and you hear a woman praying softly for her husband's affection, while behind her, a man mutters for relief from unrequited love. Desire, once again, is public, ritualized, even divine. Historians still argue whether Roman religion encouraged indulgence or restraint. Did the gods own scandals, Jupiter chasing lovers, Venus betraying Mars, justify human mischief? Or did the rituals demand restraint to balance the chaos of divine behavior? Standing among the statues, you realize both are true. The gods were mirrors of humanity, noble and ridiculous, indulgent and judgmental, divine, yet all too human. As you leave, incense clinging to your tunic, the city feels quieter, heavier. You understand now that religion wasn't just a backdrop. It was the framework, the justification, the stage where Roman ideas about men, women, and desire played out. And in those smoky halls, with gods smiling slyly from their pedestals. You see how faith both reinforced the rules and slyly allowed them to be broken. The incense smoke fades behind you as you step into the chill of the basilica, Rome's courts and offices where laws were written, read aloud, and sometimes broken with remarkable speed. Here, the language of desire and gender shifts into scrolls and decrees, into punishments and loopholes, into the dry ink of statute books. If religion offered divine blessing, law offered stern warning. And in Rome, both were constantly bent. A mainstream fact sets the tone. Under Augustus, adultery was made a public crime. The Lex Julia de Adulterias Coercendis declared that a husband could be prosecuted for failing to punish a wife caught in adultery, and men caught with married women could face exile. Imagine the emperor turning bedroom squabbles into matters of state policy. You picture senators nodding seriously while secretly panicking about their own mistresses. And then, the quirky tidbit, Augustus even exiled his own daughter Julia for her infamous affairs. The irony drips thick. While he promoted laws on chastity, his own family became the cautionary tale. Gossip spread that Julia once quipped she only boarded ships when they were full, a scandalous joke about her lovers. You chuckle at the thought, but you also see how brutally the law fell hardest on women, making their reputations fragile glass. Historians still argue whether these adultery laws were about morality or about Augustus consolidating political control. Did he truly want a virtuous Rome, or did he want leverage over rivals by threatening to expose their liaisons? The debate lingers because evidence suggests both motives at work. And you notice how the law, like religion, always had one eye on power. But adultery wasn't the only concern. Same-sex relations, especially involving freeborn male citizens, could become legal weapons. A citizen accused of being the passive partner risked charges of stuprum, a broad crime covering disgraceful sexual conduct. Punishments varied, sometimes exile, sometimes loss of status, but the sting was always social shame. Meanwhile, taking pleasure with slaves or prostitutes remained technically legal, as if exploitation somehow sanitized the act. The contradiction leaves you shaking your head. Walk down the basilica steps, and you hear the mutter of lawsuits. A husband accuses a rival of seducing his wife. Another man insists his son has been corrupted by an older patron. Lawyers gesture dramatically, invoking the laws, while everyone knows bribes flow behind the scenes. Rome pretended to be strict, but coins in the right hand smoothed over a surprising number of scandals. A quirky practice comes to mind. Divorce in Rome required no court battle. Simply a declaration before witnesses, the return of the dowry, and that was it. Some wealthy women reportedly divorced multiple husbands in rapid succession, their reputations turning them into fodder for satirists. One joke claimed a woman counted her years by her husbands, as if they were calendar months. The freedom to leave existed, but the stigma remained. You step into the archives, where scrolls crinkle and fade, recording forgotten cases. Names you'll never know whisper stories. Men exiled for affairs, women stripped of dowries, slaves punished for involvement in scandals that weren't their choice. The silence of the records is louder than their words. Historians still debate how strictly these laws were enforced. Some argue they were mostly symbolic, waved around when convenient. Others insist they shaped Roman daily behavior profoundly. You imagine both are true, strict for some, flexible for others, always depending on who you were and whom you knew. As the day wanes, you see a young couple slip quietly into a side alley. The laws might hang heavy in scrolls, but desire is swifter, bolder. Behind every statute lurks the knowledge that Rome was full of loopholes, full of laughter at Augustus's expense, full of whispered promises in torchlight. The basilica empties, the last clerks packing up wax tablets. The city exhales into night again. The laws tucked into shelves while the people of Rome return to their loves, their affairs, their secrets, and you, walking past the looming shadows of pillars, realize the law was less about ending desire than about managing it, guiding it like water in aqueducts, channeling, never stopping. You wander deeper into the streets, and the air feels heavier, as though history itself is shifting under your sandals. Rome is no longer the confident republic of togas and triumphs, nor the booming empire of marble and satire. The centuries move forward, and you find yourself in the late empire, an age of new gods, new morals, and new anxieties. Christianity spreads quietly at first, then boldly, and with it comes a reshaping of how men, women, and desire are understood. A mainstream fact anchors this moment. By the 4th century, under Constantine and later emperors, Christianity began to dominate imperial policy. Old temples fell into disrepair, while churches rose in their place. The old gods of passion and fertility, Venus, Priapus, even Mars, lost their altars. In their place, bishops preached chastity, monogamy, and the virtues of self-denial. For centuries, Rome had laughed at affairs, winked at rumors, and joked about lovers. Now, the tone turned sterner, the jokes less funny. But here's your quirky tidbit. Even as Christianity gained power, people clung to old customs in secret. Archaeologists have found amulets inscribed with Christian crosses on one side and phallic symbols on the other, like insurance policies for both faiths. You can't help but laugh, imagining a Roman muttering, "Better safe than sorry," as they wore a charm blessed by Christ and Priapus simultaneously. Old habits die hard, especially when they involve fertility and protection. Historians still argue whether this transition was sudden or gradual. Did Romans wake up one morning and abandon Venus for the Virgin Mary? Or did devotion to both overlap for generations? The evidence suggests layers, one belief fading while another grew, households practicing both until the contradictions no longer fit. Either way, you feel the cultural tide shifting under your feet, slower than a river, but stronger. As you step into a basilica-turned-church, you notice how the air has changed. Gone are the playful frescoes of dancing couples. In their place stand mosaics of saints, stern and watchful. Sermons thunder against adultery, against lust, against same-sex desire. The bishop warns that sin is not just a private shame, but a cosmic crime. You feel the contrast. What was once a laugh in juvenile satire is now a reason for eternal damnation. Women's roles change too. Once celebrated as matrons or mocked as gossips, now they are praised for virginity or motherhood, nothing in between. The Virgin Mary becomes the model of purity, and chaste widows are honored as near saints. The old balancing act of witty, influential women bends into narrower paths, and yet, behind the scenes, Christian women still wield power through networks of charity and influence, proving again that society's rules are never the whole story. Meanwhile, men face new burdens. Where once masculinity was about dominance and public dignity, now it is increasingly measured by restraint. Bishops write treatises praising those who resist temptation, who fast, who turn away from pleasure. Desire is no longer a performance to manage in public. It's a battlefield within the soul. You sigh, because this sounds exhausting in its own way, as if Rome traded one kind of performance for another. You overhear whispers of emperors enforcing harsher laws against same-sex intimacy. What once drew laughter and gossip now draws punishment and exile under Christian codes. Yet the same contradictions linger. In private, people still sought what they always sought, and scandals still rippled through courts and palaces. The difference is the tone. Mockery becomes condemnation. Indulgence becomes sin. A quirky scene plays out as you pass a crowd. Children giggle while smashing clay figurines of Venus, part of a ritual ordered by a local bishop. Parents cheer, though you suspect some of them once prayed to Venus for healthy marriages. The irony is thick. Yesterday's goddess becomes today's forbidden toy. Historians still argue whether Christianity liberated Romans from old hypocrisies or merely replaced them with new ones. Were stricter codes of morality an improvement, or did they simply bury natural desires under guilt? The debate continues, but the streets themselves whisper the truth. Desire never vanished. It simply changed costume. As night deepens over this Christianized Rome, you feel the shift in atmosphere. The old gods retreat into memory, while new saints loom in mosaic light. Men and women still love, still betray, still gossip, still long. But now, they do it under the heavy shadow of sin and salvation. You pause beneath a flickering lamp, realizing you have walked through a civilization redefined, where the laughter of Ovid has given way to the stern prayers of Augustine. And you let that weight settle in, knowing that this new age will carry echoes for centuries, shaping the way love, gender, and desire are understood long after Rome's own stones crumble. The city around you fades now into echoes, ruins under moonlight, arches casting long shadows, the air thick with memory more than sound. You've walked through Rome's tangled maze of men and women, dominance and modesty, poetry and gossip, law and ritual. Tonight, you linger on the edges of time, watching how all these fragments ripple forward, still alive in our own debates about identity and love. The mainstream fact first. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered Roman texts, quoting Ovid and Juvenal, reprinting Catullus, and studying Roman law. Their views of gender and sexuality filtered into Europe's developing codes, shaping modern ideas of marriage, morality, and even satire. When you hear jokes about men acting Greek or rules about proper marriage, you're hearing faint Roman echoes. The empire may have fallen, but its stories never stop talking. Now, for a quirky tidbit. Many English gentlemen of the 18th century carried copies of Martial's epigrams as cheeky pocketbooks. Imagine powdered wigs reading ancient graffiti for fun, whispering to each other in drawing rooms about men with smooth legs or women with sharp tongues. Rome became both model and scandal, proof that even the polished Enlightenment couldn't resist a good, dirty joke from antiquity. Historians still argue whether we should see Rome as permissive or repressive. Was it a playground of fluid desire or a cage of rigid roles? You realize, leaning against a crumbling column, that the truth is both. Rome was permissive in practice, repressive in reputation, indulgent in graffiti, strict in law. The contradictions are the lesson, not the flaw. You close your eyes and picture the mosaic of voices you've heard. Vestals tending flame, matrons bargaining, poets sighing, senators mocking, emperors scandalizing, bishops condemning. Each believed they were defining men and women, desire and duty. Yet centuries later, we're still asking the same questions. What does it mean to love, to belong, to resist, to yield? Rome reminds you that the answers are never neat. As the night deepens, you hear the hum of the Tiber like a lullaby. The statues around you soften into silhouettes, their stone faces less stern, more tired. You realize they too have witnessed the endless play of roles, the shifting lines between shame and pride, affection and ridicule. And they keep their secrets, letting each generation rediscover them with fresh eyes. Your breathing slows. The cobblestones are cool beneath you. The air smells faintly of ash and olive smoke, and you feel yourself drifting. Rome's voices murmur like waves, men boasting, women whispering, poets teasing, priests scolding. It's a chorus both ancient and familiar, a reminder that human hearts have always tangled themselves in the same messy threads, and in that realization, you let go. Rome can keep its rules, its scandals, its laughter. You carry forward only the softness, the idea that love, however judged, however mocked, never really dies. It only changes costume, speaking in new languages, waiting for someone else to whisper it again. The journey slows now, softer and slower, as if the city itself exhales. The stones of the forum cool beneath the night air, the columns fade into outlines, and the flames of oil lamps dwindle into nothing but faint smoke. You no longer hear the clamor of senators or the whisper of poets, only the steady hush of your own breath, in and out, like waves on the Tiber. Let your body sink, as though you too recline in a Roman atrium. Marble, cool against your back, stars flickering through the open roof. Around you, the house is still, the laughter gone, the gossip hushed, the quarrels of love and law folded into silence. All that remains is a gentle rhythm, steady, reassuring. The contradictions of Rome, its rules, its desires, its laughter, and its shame, can soften now into a kind of background hum. Like a lullaby sung in a language you almost understand, they surround you without demanding anything. You can let them drift away, one by one, like petals on water. The gods too quiet themselves. Venus folds her dove's wings. Mars sheathes his sword. Even Priapus, forever comic, fades into shadow. The saints step forward in mosaic light, their eyes calm, their hands raised, not in scolding now, but in blessing. And you, lying here listening, are safe to rest. You've walked through centuries tonight, felt the weight of marble and the warmth of fire, heard the laughter and the sighs of people long gone. Their echoes have rocked you gently toward sleep. Now, close your eyes, loosen your shoulders, and let the night take you. History will keep turning without you for a little while. Drift, rest, dream.